Welcome to Approaches to Listening. I'm William Taylor, and I'm joined today by Dr. Jim Douglas as we discuss common pitfalls in listening technique, as well as how musicians can optimally listen. So welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Approaches to Listening. Thank you, Dr. Douglas, for your time.
Absolutely. Nice to be here.
I have just a little preamble to start, because as we talk about exploring listening, there are just these questions that highlight the difficulty of exploring this subject. Questions like, how do you listen? How do you describe listening? And even how important is listening? Those are questions that's hard to find a definitive answer to. But I've also been thinking about a bigger obstacle potentially in learning to listen, namely that we're always doing it. If your ears work, then sound is going in, you're hearing things, and that means everyone has a significant amount of experience with listening, but we haven't flushed it out as an art or a skill. And so a question that I ponder a lot is, how many good listeners do you know? And how would you describe that person? If it's like they're a good listener, how would you define their listening? And so because listening is beyond ubiquitous, it's not well explored. And I think everyone suffers from poor listening, whether that's your listening or someone not listening to you. But I think musicians might suffer the most when listening is poorly utilized. So today we're going to explore more of how listening works and how musicians can better use listening, because it's your connection to music. And if you can take charge of that, you can explore how listening works and just utilize it the way you want. So any of those opening comments, do you have anything you'd like to add to those?
Well, I hadn't thought before, because we've had some conversations, casually before too, but about some aspects of this. I hadn't thought about your description of, if someone's a good listener, how we use that terminology.
So, I typically use it with my toddler.
Yeah.
Be a good listener.
Yeah. Well, we use it sometimes to define the character of a person, right? I mean, if someone's a good listener, what are we describing? What are we acknowledging about that person if we say, well, they're a good listener? The first thing that comes to my mind is that they can sit in silence when they're listening. They don't feel compelled to have to engage directly and immediately, for instance. They seem to actually hear the thing that they're being exposed to. So they can absorb more fully what it is that either is being said to them when we talk about a good listener, say from human in conversation, for instance. So they seem to actually understand and comprehend what is being said to them. And then their responses are different. Their responses, we often talk about somebody being a good listener, not just because they sit there quietly and never say anything, but because they often offer us responses that really reflect that they have heard what was being said, that they've assimilated what was being said, that they've processed it, and then they have responses back to us that clearly reflect that they have absorbed some of that information, and they've put it through their filters and put it through their thought processes, and then they offer something back to us that, hopefully to each of us when we're sharing something like that, that's beneficial, to the other entity as well. But if nothing else, it's maybe perhaps even beneficial to them in that sense. And so when I think about, your description of somebody being a good listener, I think there are quite a number of parallels, when we're talking about being a good listener of music too. So I think that could be an equal compliment.
Well,
thinking
of the points you just shared, good listeners comprehend what they hear. They know how to sit in silence and know how to respond. You just take those and put those in music land. We all have heard musicians who don't comprehend what they're playing, or who can't stand silence, or don't know how to respond. And so those are what make performances great, at least in part. And so listening, I think it's such a smooth segue into knowing all those things, being able to practice all of those things. But we commonly have this issue: where do you start when talking about listening? And I think you can find plenty of tips out there of like preparing to listen, like maybe meditate. I've seen yoga classes for musicians so they can slow down instead of just being busy. Don't do anything else while you're listening, just be with the music. But those aren't describing the listening itself, more like the getting ready to listen. So in my mind, the first thing that needs to be established are your approaches to listening, meaning how are you engaging with the listening, not the prep, but the listening itself. And that goes into my 4 filters, these 4 distinct approaches that permit certain information to come in or stimuli, and they exclude other information or stimuli. So today I'd love to go through each filter and explore its benefits and potential pitfalls for musicians, because I feel like if you let something in, you're excluding something else. You can't let everything in all at once, if that makes sense. So any thoughts on that before we dive into the filters themselves?
No, I think that makes sense. I mean, brain scientists have learned a number of years ago. Well, it used to be, I don't know how far back, but it used to be that they thought that we could multitask. That brain scientists thought, well, this is how the brain functions, and we were all sort of obsessed with what it means to be able to juggle these multiple things and how amazing that was. But then they learned over time that actually wasn't the way the brain was working, that it only can do one thing at a time. What it does do very well is it darts very quickly back and forth. Sometimes it does it so well that it seems as if we're multitasking, but we're actually not. We're only concentrating on one thing at a time. And the other thing that seems to be a multitasking, or more 2 things that we might be doing are actually sort of functioning on an autopilot kind of a feature. But that's also what our brains do really well too. I think that's not unlike aspects of learning how to listen. I think there are some parallels with that too, that we've got certain things we can focus on and we can learn how to focus on. But I think that we need to be careful, and as we go through and talk about your filters here, that we probably can't do multiple of these things at the same time. So it's understanding how to move back and forth, either consciously or subconsciously, what's going on in order to best maximize, the usage of these categories.
Yeah, and that's a skill that I don't know anyone who's mastered, but there are definitely those who have some tools, and I'm excited to get into some of those. So let's start with the analytical filter. And I guess the first question is, what does this filter offer musicians? And to me, just some quick answers. I think it offers sustainability, understanding. It gives you language to discuss music, and it can make things measurable. For me, analysis is the art of dissection. You're taking something apart to figure out each piece and how it fits into a whole. But you need to remember that analysis is a zoomed in perspective. And so that's what it offers. If you know how every part works, then if something's not working, you can go, oh, that's a fingering issue. Oh, that's the pianist's fault. This E flat doesn't work. And you have the language to describe it. It's like, oh, well, there's something sticky under the key, and now the action isn't working quite right.
So does analytical also include things like making decisions about the inherent, say, compositional characteristics of the piece of music? So structure or form or harmonic, or is it those features, or is it more broadly applied in larger topics or larger concepts?
I think, because you asked the word decisions, I think that has to do more with the critical The analytical is
Okay.
about seeing what is there
Okay. All right.
in the smallest pieces you can, and then fitting them together.
Okay.
I'd say. But for me, that's just a brief answer of what analysis offers musicians. And when you look at a performing musician come recital time, say they're performing from memorization, and they forget, their muscle memory gives out on them. They could draw an analysis and be like, I know it's a perfect authentic cadence. So I know how to find a 5/7 chord and then a 1, and then muscle memory kicks in. Oh yeah, now you know what to do. So that makes things sustainable and reliable. That's just one of the benefits. Analysis, you can stack these layers on top of each other. And then you also know how to nerd out about stuff with people, which is one of my favorite things, where it's like, oh, I know why that was so moving, and I can tell you why. Those are all benefits of analysis. Any benefits to analysis you'd like to throw on the pile?
No, I think having what you mentioned as it gives us the language to talk about certain things. I think that may be at least one of the most critical components of this filter to me out of your descriptions, because I think it is important to have language to express what we're seeing in a piece of music, what we want to communicate about the piece of music. And I think that's important even to ourselves. I don't discredit intuition, gut, natural talent, all the stuff that sometimes isn't, you can't put terminology to or even an explanation. But I do find that when we can, and the closer we can come to that, we benefit, I think, more so as teachers trying to communicate certain things to students, or as establishing our own teacherness for ourselves, right? Ultimately becoming our own monitor and our own teacher to a certain degree, and monitor ourselves as musicians and making decisions in all kinds of ways, right? Having that external and internal voice going on with us. I do think that language that you mentioned in the analytical benefits that, and that may be one of the most critical things that we can do for ourselves.
Yeah, I remember my older brothers in particular, I'm like, oh, I love this piece. And they put the pressure on. I'm like, why? I think it's a bad piece because it has a lousy chord progression, and the performer doesn't shape things well. Right. And then I just be all embarrassed about, well, I don't have any reason. It just makes me feel good.
It's a good thing nobody asked Brahms those questions about the poetry he chose to set, for songs, because about half of his song output probably wouldn't exist if we made him feel guilty about the quality of poetry that he chose. But he chose that poetry because it made him feel certain ways, and he was open to responding to that emotion and to that feeling as a motivator to want to set that point, for instance.
And that leads into just some of the pitfalls that can come using this filter, because this isn't not one of these filters. You don't want to use just one all the time. And so how can this filter lead musicians, let's just say, where they don't want to go, through either misuse or overuse? And I guess my first thought there was, how much analysis do you want to use in performance? And I know if I am analyzing from start to finish in performance, one, I have no idea how the performance really went. And two, I don't enjoy the performance. I'm not there with the music. I'm just like, it's like the white knuckle performance. Yeah. It's like, I need to do this. Now I need to get ready for this. And
so I'm trying to keep separate in my head your distinction between analytical and critical as these two or four filters. I believe that's right.
Yes.
And so I'm trying to imagine what I would be preoccupied by, analytically, that for me, I think probably falls into the critical aspect. Meaning not just am I doing, a good job or a bad job in the moment. I don't mean the self-critique of id and the consciousness and the ego and all that kind of stuff. I mean, even deciding, was that a good passage? Did I play that cleanly? So, that sort of self-assessment when we go through. I'm trying to think that maybe analysis, I need to rethink that analysis according to this filter is more about, so I do think we can get in our ways. I'm generally not a big proponent of what would be the word, academic thinking when we're in the mode of performance. I think that's for all of the stuff beforehand. When we go back out to perform, we have to find an organic way of connecting with the energy and the genuineness of what that music means at that moment for the listeners, the way that they're going to engage with it, as opposed to all the work that I've done, prior to this moment. They shouldn't be, and they won't be interested in an academic approach to something because it's just simply not interesting to perform that way, right?
Yeah.
And so, but on the other hand, I think that there are some things that analytically, I think this applies to your filter, that I could stay aware of. So, for instance, being aware of reading the energy or the emotion in a room in any particular moment in the piece, for instance, right? If I'm getting a sense of the crescendo and the energy building towards a climax, if I have an incredibly pianissimo passage, and understanding that it's not just a dynamic level that's maybe creating intensity, but there is something, perhaps even an emotional framework behind this. Being aware of that, being aware of how it might be connecting or being listened to by the audience, and understanding how to use that.
Absolutely.
And I don't mean in the negative manipulative way, but I mean use it in the sense of, how long do I want to take on this retard at a final cadence? Or how long do I want to hold the last chords? Or how long do I keep, if it's a subito silent place, a grand pause, how long do I stay in that moment, for instance, which are all ultimately musical expressive devices. But I feel like they need to be linked to what's happening on that piano in that room in front of that particular group of people. Otherwise, we become little robots. We sort of play things the same way all the time, which will work nicely in some moments and not so nicely in other moments. So I think there's an analysis that we can be aware of that's not academic. Does that make sense, that description?
Yeah,
I think we can't be unaware of a number of things when we're playing, when we're in the mode of performance.
Yeah, the way I describe it, and I talk about this in earlier episodes, is for me, that's a really healthy balance between the analytical filter and the experiential filter, where you're zipping back and forth. Because how do you read the room? You could gauge the decibels according to your best knowledge, or you can feel it out. Just step out and your brain's like, I want to read the room because that'll help me know what I need to do next. And then you feel it out. You're like, it's a little dry. I'm going to throw in a little more pedal and maybe get a little deeper into the keys. So that to me is a marriage of the two. I'm thinking of a quote from Dr. Catherine Pukinskis. She's a professor at Carnegie Mellon University. She said of analysis that, quote, analysis is slow. And I think that's a very apt description of analysis, because something clues you in that you want to test the sound in the room. And then the second you're like, what is the sound? Is your brain with your fingers? I don't think so. Your brain out in the hall? Yeah. And so you're not right with what you're doing. It's to fuel what you're doing, but you're not right there. So analysis takes you out of the moment. That moment where you're like, I need to read the room. My brain is here. And then I send it out there to get a feel for things. And analysis, I think that is its key one of its defining features, is that it takes you out of the moment. It can feed the moment in remarkable ways. You need analysis, absolutely. But it takes you out of the moment, and then this speaks to why you need these other filters It's like, I need to analyze something for the moment. And when you can do that, that's, I feel, a really optimal use. It's when you get stuck in analysis. It's like, now do this fingering. Now make sure that you find this low note before you play it, and find it again, and find it again, find it before you play it, yeah. And now I need to remember that I want to keep my hand parallel while I do my arpeggio. That's the performance that is, I think, the little robot performance. If you can blend that to make sure you get the arpeggios right with what shape do I want to feel? Do I want to feel this, I don't know, updraft of motion inside me when I play that? That's a good marriage, in my opinion.
I agree. But I also think that some of those things that you're describing are actually can be very much part of the prepping process, the preparation process. Well, I like to just call it the process, because I'm a huge believer in the process. What the process looks like for each of us, how do we maintain the process, how do we build the process, what are the tools in the toolkit of each of our individual processes, as we go through this. So I do think that things like building in the shape, am I aware of the shape of this? Or do I feel the key in a big jump, a quick jump? Do I feel the key before I play it, in a jump? In other words, those are technical components as well, right? And so I think that we can have an awareness of that without necessarily becoming so front consciousness in the performance that it distracts from the musicality, or distracts from the organic music making that we want to ultimately be doing. So I think that can be practiced in there as well, to where we can tap into what we've been working on, like a gymnast who runs really fast and does the I forget what they call the device where they jump over the springboard deal and they kind of do the amazing flips. There is no consciousness in what they do with that. It goes too fast.
Right.
I think we've got the same things in some things that we play. We cannot be conscious about what we're doing, no matter what we are needing to be aware of. So I think there are levels with that. I don't want to get distracted too far or head into some other stuff. But I do think that there are some aspects about that can be practiced in to where it is a subconscious act, or it's a part of the physicality of muscle memory, even to a certain degree. Yeah. And we can monitor it, tap on it just a minute, or remind ourselves in a fleeting split second that that's what I want to do, without this. I think this is the multitasking darting thing we were talking about a while ago. That can do that, and it doesn't necessarily pull me away from this larger thing of being in the moment, for instance, or not being academic. I don't think that has to academize the moment of the execution itself, or the music making that we're trying to accomplish.
I agree, and I think that highlights one of the biggest misuses of the analytical filter that I see, and I think it's well captured in the phrase, I'll throw that in once we get to the performance.
Oh yes.
I know I need to put that there, and it's like, it, but you don't feel it, and that's a problem.
Yeah.
And so I think that analysis, it's so vital for practice.
Yeah.
It's absolutely vital. I mean, you take a big piece and you take it apart so you can learn it, so you can play the huge thing. And then, if you don't start putting it back together in the practice room, you're like, all the pieces will, I don't know, it's like in the Lego movie where it's like, they just zoom in and it's like, magically they're there. It's like, you should practice in more than just analysis. So I know we've talked about this some, but any other thoughts on how to take full advantage of analysis as a musician?
Full advantage of analysis. Well, I think, the first thing that I think of is that I think it has to work for us on two levels, perhaps, to think of it as. I think it has to work for us in the broadest concepts that we can bring to what we're doing as we're learning a piece of music or processing a piece of music. But I also think that, and maybe this is applicable to all of these filters. I'm not sure I've thought that far ahead yet on the others, but that I don't know. I always love discovering textures, whether it's in a learning process, or when it's in analyzing a poem, or looking at the voicings that a composer has built, in a piece of music, for instance. Texture and dimensionality is just incredibly important to me. And it's a constant thing that I'm searching for and reacting to, sometimes when I'm not even realizing it. So analysis in a broader sense, and then in discovering how it can help me maybe target certain things as well. And how to find the balance in those things, or use both of those things in creating the best sort of filtering process, so I can consciously, and perhaps even work subconsciously, but I can sort of be actively making the best sort of assortment of decisions as I'm going along, whether it's in the process or whether it's in the performance.
Yeah, I think of analysis as expanding the potential you have to perform the piece,
I like that description.
Appreciate the piece.
Yeah.
But it's important. I don't think analysis on its own could ever fill that vessel. I think it's focused way more on building it.
Yeah.
And then you have to go to the more feeling-based filters to fill that up and utilize its full potential.
Yeah. I just want to say, for the video version of this, I'm not actually checking my phone for text. I'm in fact getting back to the list that you had sent at one point in time, because I'm thinking about the other application of this, or cross application of some of these things with what some of the other aspects of this. I'm not sure, looking at the other categories. Yeah, maybe the last one, exploratory, but I'm not sure that this what I just described as both sort of a macro and micro apply as fully to these other categories as maybe analytical. I think this might have the most application in this particular filter.
And it's interesting because any serious study of music begins and ends, as of right now, with analysis. It's like, if you want to study music, you start with analysis. You end with analysis. You look at any music course, you're going to be hard pressed to find 10% maybe that isn't analysis. And that poses some, let's say, obstacles to accessing the feeling side of listening and music as a whole.
Is analysis where judgment comes in?
That's the critical.
Okay, gotcha. Of course.
So let's segue there. But I think one of the biggest things to remember about analysis before we move on is just remember to be intentional in your use of analysis. I feel it's such an easy default for serious musicians because it's how you build anything more than what you have. But if you can recognize I'm analyzing, that means I'm not with the live music. Maybe I'm building the house that music can occupy, or decorating the space that music could occupy, but I'm not there with it because I'm building the place for it. I think that's really important, because then once you realize you're analyzing, you can at least figure out where you want to go from there. But that leads us into filter number 2, the critical filter, which is the judgmental filter, if you want to call it that. And this filter is figuring out what's right and what's wrong, or if you'd like, what you like and what you don't like. So what does this filter offer? It offers the opportunity to be right, which in music, it's nice sometimes to be like, I did it right. That's comfortable. It's the apex of measurability when someone makes a rubric and you check off everything in that rubric.
Hmm.
I think it offers trust. Who are you going to hire? The musician who you've evaluated and been like, oh, they constantly deliver, or someone you don't know despite their credentials. And I think there's another thing that I'd almost say it's a temptation, but the critical filter offers you the chance to be done, to reach a goal and be like, that's the thing. Which in music, I mean, when are you done with your favorite work of music? You performed it and you're like, that's perfect. I'm never going to perform it again. I don't think that's how we work. But the critical filter can say, hey, you reached this level and that's the highest level you've ever aimed for. So you did it. And those are all offerings of the critical filter. Anything you want to add to what this filter
Well, I mean, critical seems to me that there are two factors I'm thinking of from your description just now, which is, and unless it seems like maybe everything falls into these two categories, but please add to this if you think not. But it seems like there's an external application and an internal application of what critical is or how we use it. So external meaning perhaps, do I like this piece of music and why, if I have to articulate it, right? If somebody asks me, or if I need to have, for some reason, give account of this. And it has to be more than just, I like it, which is not necessarily invalid in many contexts, right?
Yeah.
But it's not always going to be the only valid response either. But so we use it externally to make decisions about that. We use it externally to make decisions about other performances that we hear, whether it's about the performer or the music that they've performed. Do we like that piece? Do we like that composer? Do I think that's a quote good composer? We could sidetrack ourselves and get into discussions of what right and good means when we're making these,
right,
sort of assessments and using those terms.
But I think it's important to know that everyone has a right and good that they use.
Yes.
I don't think anyone is without that.
No, I agree. And so I think the trick with the external part of it is finding the balance between the subjective and the objective versions of what those right and good means. So for instance, when you're on a search committee and you're previewing applicants for a teaching position of a performance, music performance person, right? And so that group of people are having to use their external critical factors to make determinations about that group of applicants, right? That pool of applicants. And so those factors have to be agreed upon. They have to be sort of worked out. They have to be, we have all kinds of external filters, which certainly interface with the subjective part of my filters, as well as trying to find an objective, aspect of this as well. So it's why it's a good thing that groups like processes like they have multiple people, so that you can find consensus, and it's not just based on an individual's like or dislike about the way that person played Chopin, for instance, right? In their videos. So there are, I think, valid reasons to use the external critical, mechanisms with this as well. I think for me, and that gets us into all kinds of fun and challenging conversations with colleagues and friends and podcasts and debates and reviews of albums and, opinions, right? That's the intersection with all of that. For me, the more interesting and I think the more powerful part of critical is the internal, is what we have to tap into and what we have to monitor and what we learn to use about ourselves and our own consciousnesses and our personality. I'm not sure consciousness is a word, but our personalities, our own ids, our own egos. Are we self-critical? Do we have confidence? Do we not have confidence? What version of any combinations of all those things do we have when we are looking at the internal critical mechanisms? And those, to me, I think, just like My teacher at University of Alabama used to say to us, we used to have to record every lesson that we had, every single lesson. And lest we thought it was just an empty exercise, she would actually ask us at some point in time later, do you remember that lesson 3 weeks ago on your Muchinsky, piece? Do you recall when you played so-and-so? But my response was, and I asked you to go and listen to that. So she would actually put us on the spot to find out. And also there was pedagogical purpose to it, but to put us on to see if we were actually listening to these things, right? So her big factor, and she was a big record everything, record your lessons, record practice sessions, record recitals, record dress rehearsals, record and listen and listen and listen. Because she felt that developing the listening tool of ourselves and learning how to become more objective about listening to ourselves was one of the most critical features in determining our own self-destiny to a certain degree, our self-direction, but also an accurate sense of what we were doing. So like you just said, if you play something well, say so. Be able to acknowledge that in my assessment in the moment, if that's possible for some people. But certainly when you listen to it later, right? Don't let those negative voices that are sort of self-critical all the time, if that happens to be our personalities, those self-critical voices, distract and teach us negative things about ourselves when we actually are doing really positive things. So I think it's as important for us to recognize when we do something positive, when we do something well, as when we do something that needs to be improved. And this critical internal voice, this is how we use the critical filter in that internal way, I think is maybe one of the most challenging things that we have to do as artists and people. But I also think it's maybe perhaps the most singular critical thing that we can do for ourselves in fully understanding who we are and how we can accomplish what our goals are, and understanding when those goals have been met, and then how to keep growing from there.
I think of the experience of performing in a studio class, and say the student's goal was perfection, and they give a great performance but messed up the passage that they most wanted to ace, and then they get the feedback. It's like, it was incredible, these lines were incredible, I felt so much, and you can see that just bounce off of the student, and they're like, drop the other shoe, tell me I failed. And it's like, you failed in 5 seconds of the 7-minute work. If you want to call it a fail because you flubbed a position change or something. But I think that's absolutely right.
And it can go the other way too. It's not always just the overly self-critical that's a problem. There's a delusional critical filter, right? When
absolutely
we think that perhaps what we're doing is good, or it works at a high level, or it is valid, for whatever reason we might think that it is, when in fact no one else would agree with that.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting thing to once again balance the yes, that's what I want, and the no, that's what I don't want, and to be able to not let either paralyze you or just keep you from the moment. Because once again, the critical filter, for me, it's an out of the moment filter. I'm confident in saying, if you're criticizing, if you're saying, is this right? Is this wrong? Is this what I want? Then you're not right with the thing. And if you're never right with the thing, how are you supposed to know for sure if it's what you want or what you don't want? And so I think there's that level of delusion too.
I think about actors who say they never watch themselves, in a movie when it's finished. That fascinates me, because the only way that I can think that they must understand that they have confidence in what they're doing is either from the other entities around them telling them so, and they just decide to trust that director or whoever that other entity may be, or they I don't really know where they would get it from, or they have just such supreme confidence in knowing that what they've done in the moment, that they can assess that as a good thing, that they don't need to have feedback, right? Perhaps that's true. I'm sure there must be musicians maybe who do function at that level. I'm not sure that I've met any or had conversations with them who could accurately assess it to that way, that they really don't want to listen back to that album that they just recorded. That just seems so improbable for musicians as a parallel for musician world, not to listen back to what we do at some point, right? At some point. Maybe I don't have to listen back to that album every month or every year after I've created it, but in that moment of determining, the quality in the end product, it seems remarkable to me not to engage with that the way that some actors have described, being uncomfortable. But we all, it's a very universal thing that when we hear ourselves speaking in a recording, almost everyone goes, "Oh gosh, is that what I sound like? Oh, I hate the way my voice sounds," right? That is an incredibly universal thing. I think that's a part of what we deal with, as performance musicians. I think it's a very parallel issue.
Agreed. And it brings me into just one of the pitfalls I'd say I've encountered with the critical filter. I think it's an especially potent filter. That's kind of the end goal is, and what, did I do it or did I not?
Yeah.
And I think
yes,
it's overused just across the board by musicians who first practice session, they go in and they're like, "That wasn't right. Let's do it again. That wasn't right." It's like, it's not time for the critical filter yet. You don't have a finished product. And so if you work in that sort of listening memory, like muscle memory, where everything is right or wrong from the beginning to the end, and come performance time, all you're left with is the right and wrong, not the moment, not the audience reaction. And it's just this really restrictive approach to listening. And I was notorious about this as a teenager. I listened in right and wrongs, and so I only heard right and wrongs. It's like, oh, this is
the binary. It's black and white. It's just this or that.
It got to the point, it's pop, it's wrong. It was bad, and I made a lot of people around me mad as I dove into analysis of why it was bad and they didn't have their answer. But I think especially for performing musicians, there's a time and place to use the critical filter, and I think it's best used in short bursts. Use it and then go to the other ones. Don't leave that incredibly high heat filter on all the time. You'll get burned out. No one wants to just deal with right and wrong all the time, especially in art.
I agree. And I think that's such a good description. I think you're right. I think it's also one of those things that is probably out of these four filters, it's perhaps is the one that's the least useful in the moment of performance.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Either direction. With either self-adulation or self-criticism. It's probably the least helpful in the moment of performance.
I agree. I think of a experience. I had just started my master's degree and was performing on a charity concert with the head of the voice department at TCU. And I was terrified. It was the first time I performed for my teacher, performed for fellow students, performed in Fort Worth generally. And I got to the concert and my teacher was like, "How are you feeling?" And I'm like, "I'm terrified right now." And he looked at me and in full seriousness said, "What are you afraid of? Yeah. It's just music." Yeah. And I was like, that's if only I could believe that and remember that more often.
No one's life depends on it. No one's going to die if our performance is bad. It's not that kind of thing that we do. But that's not really, if that helps us deal with that aspect of it, great. put in that context. But it's also not the purpose either, right?
Mhm.
I mean, I think being reminded of what the purpose is just as helpful as being reminded of what it's not and why we feel so anxious about it.
Right. And so thinking about this realm of the critical filter, the last question is just how do you use it optimally? And I think it's at identifying those spots where it should be used, both to identify the good and the bad,
Mm-hmm.
turn it on, let it do its work, and then shut the thing off
Mm-hmm.
and go back and do the other things.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you made a brilliant point. Make sure that when it's on, that the good, you receive it just as much as you do the bad, because I've seen very few musicians who
Mm-hmm.
can keep those balanced. Like,
Mhm.
oh, that's the bad and that's the good. Okay, they're equal to me. I'll take
Mhm.
them equally.
And for most of us, I think that is the most critical one. I mean, that's the one we deal with the most. I think it's the smaller percentage of us who have, egos large enough to where the problem actually is the self-congratulatory, version of our experiences are so numerous and so, overblown or not clearly representative of the thing that happened. That's not usually what most of us deal with. I'm sure there are examples of that out there, but that's not what most of us deal with, in that sense. And I also think, there was a last thing I'll throw in with it. I thought of this with a description you were saying just a little while ago, is that sometimes we also get very myopic and narrowly focused on one thing as a factor of whether that's to be critical of or to assess as to whether that was successful, what we just did. So we see, pianists who get very focused on, did I play wrong notes? And they feel good about a performance, really good sometimes about a performance, if they just didn't miss any wrong notes, or they missed very few wrong notes, right? And that's not helpful, because the performance could still be just as flat as a flitter and completely uninteresting and non-expressive even, if that's the only thing that they're gauging or using to create. And we've all heard pianists who we can imagine that that's probably the only filter, the only thing that they're critical of for themselves, and the only thing they're trying to satisfy is something like, just simply playing correctly.
Yeah.
Right? And so there you go. We have all those discussions about what's the fabric of what we're trying to self monitor and be critical of, in that sense, to determine also whether we can accurately assess, in the critique of ourselves, accurately assess what we just did.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, a brief recap of these two filters before we move on to the feeling filters. Analytical and critical. I think, use the word myopic, I think in both cases they require you to zoom in and examine details. And those details, when examined, it's like, is this here? Is this really what it is? Take you out of the moment. But these are two filters that you can use to listen to anything. And they have their pros and they have their cons. So make sure you know which one you're using and when. So filter number 3, the experience or experiential filter. I'll go ahead and read out, what does it offer? For me, this is the visceral reaction that music brings, the stuff you feel in your heart, your body, the experiences of you crying or moving. I think that the experiential filter brings those moments that later become memories in music. Those all start with experience. And a big one for me is when I experience music, I am filled with desire. I just want to do things. I want to sit, I want to feel, I want to move, I want to, be a better musician. And so experience, one of the biggest and best things it offers is that, I don't know if tweaking is the right word, or amplification of desire, but it just sparks something that gives me that desire, which is always useful when you're engaging with things like practice every day, or even just like day-to-day chores. It's like, I don't want to do the chores. Well, I'll put on something upbeat. Now I do. I'll get moving. I can buy into this now. So that's just one of the great benefits to me of the experiential filter.
Yeah. So I think the experiential is maybe the reason why most of us have chosen to be musicians. It's probably also the reason why a lot of us who aren't either professional musicians or trying to figure out, how to be engaged with it in this sort of full-time kind of a level of stuff. But there are those of us who feel incredibly strongly about music, right? The amateur, and when I say amateur, I simply mean someone who's not engaged as a profession, with music. But the amateur who has a bigger record collection than any professional musician that I know, for instance, right? The amateur who goes to more concerts than I do, because the only way that they can feel this experience and have this experience is by live engagement. That's how they've figured out to sort of tap into some aspects of that we as performers get to do differently, right? So I figured out, I think a few years ago, that I had some friends who wanted me to go hang gliding with them off the point of a mountain in Western North Carolina. And at first I was a little interested, and then I realized, wait, why? And my wife, by the way, wasn't so excited about this idea, because we weren't spring chickens, any of us either, that were talking as a group of male friends, and none of us were spring chickens, and we were talking about doing this. So and then I realized I didn't really want to do it, but there was an aspect about it that I thought was interesting. But then I realized that it was like, I've never had any interest in bungee jumping. I've never had any interest in anything that's particularly physically cortisol driving, creating. And for a few years ago, I think I figured out that the reason for me why I'm not interested is because when I walk out on the stage and perform, I get that cortisol rush. I have that adrenaline surging through my veins. And I thought, well, yeah, that makes total sense why some people who don't engage with what this means to be a performer are interested in things like this, because there is a thing about that adrenaline rush. There is a thing about those cortisol levels, right, that is very physical. It's very real, and it does something to us as an experience. And I thought, well, okay, that seems fair. So they need to bungee jump, and I'm going to keep playing recitals. I'm going to keep performing in front of people, right? Because I think there's some shared elements of what it does to our psyches and bodies, and I think that's why I wasn't that really interested. I don't need any more than what I've already got just dealing with my professional life, in other words, which is on a regular basis. I have certainly more so than most people are bungee jumping in their lives, right? And so that aspect of the experiential, I think, is critical to all of us. And I do think it's the thing that we're searching for. I think it's the thing that we're wanting to engage with. I think it's the most mercurial out of your filters. I think it's the hardest to describe. It's the hardest to articulate exactly how to achieve, but good heavens, we know it when we've had it. Anybody who's had this experience of the experiential, the positive side of experiential, knows how powerful a motivator it is, to have that experience. The zone, some people call it. When you're in the zone in performance, which we don't all have that. You know, in fact, most of us don't experience it most of the time, and so it becomes this thing we're in search of. You know, also, and I don't mean this is the only aspect of experiential filter, you know, that there is worth looking at, but I do think it may be the most powerful in certain ways.
I agree. And talking about those moments, one of the reasons I chose collaborative piano was because I found out how to find those moments in collaboration, and it's just, you can't surpass that experience where it's like,
I agree.
all of a sudden it's like, I know exactly what you're going to do, how you're going to do it. We've never talked about it.
Yeah.
And I know exactly what I need to do and what I need to feel to make it happen. And then you go backstage and you just look at each other. It's like, just give each other a hug. It's like,
Yeah.
thanks for being there with me.
Yeah. It's a solo pianist. It is one thing when you can have that emotional moment, that emotional, and when I say I don't mean people are crying, I just mean this sort of genuine experiential of feeling, you know, something that's intense, something that's absolutely shared in the space. There's
Right.
no denying that part of it. It is one thing to have that experience, to know how to manipulate that experience in the good way, in the best way possible.
Right.
To even create that experience, to know how to create it even on a predictable, you know, pattern, for instance. But I agree that as a collaborative pianist, it is another level of engagement. I agree with you that when you have that experience with one or more performers at the same time on a stage in the same way, to share that experience and to know that happened with multiple performers who have this, either you're synced up or everybody's aware of it, or you can sense that the audience is having it. It is, I think it's even more powerful to come off the stage and realize that there was a shared human experience with us as performers that achieved that experience, you know, for the room, performers and listeners. That I agree. I think it's, for me, it became much more powerful of an experience than doing that as a solo pianist.
I was thinking about this just recently and thinking about unity and collaboration. It's like, how do you unify with someone or a group of people? And to me, the answer is you find a shared moment. And once that happens, things might never be the same with those people or that group of people. But it begs the question, and you mentioned this is the hardest filter to just like describe and know how to get into. So the question, how do you get into this state of experience? And it's a big question, but one of the ways I would say is you have to make sure you're not, that you can separate yourself from a thinking filter. Those thinking filters, they won't let you in the moment. I'm convinced of that. If you're analyzing or critiquing, the moment will be there and it will be gone.
Yeah, I think I agree. Absolutely.
It's so interesting because without analysis and critique, experience becomes so wishy-washy. You think of performers who don't practice well, don't know what they're doing, and don't know what they would say is right or wrong. You know, those aren't the performances we want. But you need to be able to step away from the thinking and just enter the state of being that exists in the moment. And so how to get there, I don't know if I can offer a definitive answer, but I do know that you need to be able to release the thinking.
Yeah, I know it sounds like a cheesy terminology, but the letting go part, there's an aspect of exploring what letting go means. And it's not a particularly helpful or specific description. We all think we understand, you know, conceptually what we mean when we say letting go. But how to do that is so individualized. The mechanisms of doing so, I think, are so uniquely personal to each of us. And I don't know if all of those elements can be analyzed by an outside party in order to help that person get there, other than to keep reinforcing for them that it is happening or it's not happening. And even then, I'm a little doubtful that that's particularly helpful. I'd be hesitant about being in that position and wanting to always take that position of feeling like that's the feedback that I needed to provide, to a certain degree. My former teacher my doctoral teacher used to say, a thing will not be moved until it's ready to be moved. And I found that to be very useful in teaching. And also an understanding my own development of process, right? I just think that is so remarkably universally applicable in so many ways. And I think it may be the most helpful in understanding the things that are the most mercurial to get our heads around, either for ourselves or as a teacher, someone who is working with other musicians in their development and evolution, of their gifts or their life phases, or whatever it is, when I witness what those things are. So I do think that this aspect is the most difficult to tap into internally and externally, as an observer or as a mentor or in giving feedback, but also for just ourselves personally. I think it's an important question that you ask, and I agree with you. I think it's the most difficult one to sort of figure out any, what we want to say, predictable advice or predictable steps.
I did remember something that I believe I included in an earlier podcast episode. But if you want the moment, I'm confident that listening is the key. And if you don't know how to listen, then you won't know how to let go the right way. If you're performing and you're like, I want to be in the moment, but you're like, well, what am I going to hold on to if I let go of my analysis and critique? It's like, I will listen. That gives you something. That gives you
I think you're right.
And I am convinced that listening is the key to the moment. But it made me think of this Lord of the Rings quote. It's a dangerous business, Frodo, going out your door. You step onto the road, and if you don't keep your feet, there's no knowing where you might be swept off to. And I feel like that is the experience in performance, or even just in listening. If you let go of what you know, which experience allows you to do, you don't know where you're going to go. But that's the exciting part. You're going to have a moment that you've never had. Because I feel like moments, you'll get them once, maybe twice. But then that moment has done its thing. The moment has happened. So you need a new moment.
Yeah.
And if you keep trying to find that old moment, it might get you close to that realm.
Yeah.
But that old moment isn't going to come alive.
And I agree. And I think here's where our jazz friends have a leg up on us.
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely.
Because they are very much about being in that moment. They're very much about sort of being open to the creative juices that can create, some aspect of that. And we don't have to get off into, that would be an amazing discussion in another, realm about what does that creative juice do when it's completely spontaneous to a certain degree. I mean, we all know jazz people practice. I didn't know that for a long time. I thought it was all just bing. But that was my naivety in understanding, how jazz musicians worked. But I do think that this aspect of the moment is more critical and powerful, and that they're more open to it and they're more comfortable with it. For us, it feels we're so much about, because the technical demands in high-level jazz are very high too. So this is not to separate these two worlds, but the the technical tools, of what's needed in this field that we work in are pretty demanding.
And I would say narrower.
And maybe narrower. Yeah, in that sense. Yeah.
Isn't a bad thing. But...
No, but you're right. But those are the parameters. And so with those narrower parameters in a sense, and the fact that it's not about spontaneous music or spontaneous creation in the way that jazz is, yes, I do think it's much easier for practitioners of Western classical art music to fully be distracted by all of those parameters, of which they're working so hard to be able to achieve, that it becomes very difficult to find that ability to just be open in the moment in the way that our jazz friends do. Right?
Yeah.
We're not as comfortable with that. We're not sure what that means. We're not sure how to let that connection sort of happen in a very organic, natural, quote, free-spirited sort of way. I'm not sure that's the best word. But I do try to think of, sometimes when I'm performing and playing classical repertoire, I do actually try to think of what the experience must be like for a jazz performer. And I won't say that I'm trying to replicate it, but I'm trying to understand a parallel with that, and to say, what can I experience that in my fixed music, sort of process and end result, what can I experience, and how can I manage this in a way that taps into some aspect about what that spontaneity means in improvised music.
And thinking about that, one last comment about jazz musicians. I was speaking with my friend Patrick Summers, who did the last episode with me for the podcast. And in one of our conversations, I asked if he knew of any other type of musician who uses all four filters actively in their music making, other than jazz musicians. And he said, no, he's a jazz pianist. And that just speaks to the potential they have. I think it's like you're listening in such a varied way, always. It's like, shouldn't every musician do that? And so really quick wrapping up the experiential filter. I think the pitfalls are when it's not paired with the thinking just right, with the analytical, with the analysis, with the critique. You think of someone who loves their favorite piece and runs through it like 10 times a day and doesn't practice the hard spots, and then they get to recital and they love it, but it falls apart a little bit. And that you need to pair it with the expansions that thinking and analysis and critique offer.
And experiential, chasing the experiential alone, or as the primary goal, it opens temptation to the process not being paid enough attention to as well, right? So I think we've all witnessed performances where we could tell that we call it bluster, or we call it other things, where the performer simply tried to depend too much on creating an experiential moment, and it feels like as a way of distracting from the absence of the other tools, or the other mechanisms.
Yes.
Right? And that feels just as unsatisfying, frankly.
Absolutely. Some of my most uncomfortable experiences hearing performance were those where I was just physically uncomfortable, whereas if it's dry, I'm just uninterested. Yeah,
and even more recently, recently, I've had the experience of someone who actually all the tools had been, marvelously exercised, but it felt like the chase of the experiential, the effort to create the experiential, was so somewhat artificial that I tend to use the word affected in a performance like that. to where it felt manipulated in a way that wasn't emotionally genuine.
Yes, which is
equally unsatisfactory to at least to me.
It's the offensive light flashing in my brain. Maybe I need to resort my filters as I think about that one. But I think for the optimal use for this one is just make sure it's blended in with everything you do. If you're not feeling your music each day, I don't know what to tell you. I have a teacher who told me if I wasn't going to be fully invested in my music each day, he said, go be a dentist. And it's worth thinking about. If you're not experiencing your music and feeling it every day, having your desire channeled by it, and you're a musician, I would evaluate your listening. As you said, the experiential filter, these are your words, it's the thing we're looking for. And if you're not getting that each day, then, well, that's a good time to move on to filter 4, which is exploration. And I would say this is the least used filter, just period, anywhere. So what does this filter offer? I'd say discovery. And that could mean discovery of something big or something small. It's your ticket when you want to actively listen but don't know what you're listening for. It's how you will find something new. To me, this is the filter that most of all zooms out and just examines music in a feeling-based manner and just sees generally what's there. And this is my experience with the exploratory filter. If I don't know which filter to turn on, I try to think of the exploratory filter. I widen my perception. I'm like, I don't know what I'm looking for. And every time that I just put a blank slate in front of a piece and say, I don't know what I'm looking for, immediately the piece becomes so interesting. Things pop out to me left and right. It's a hard one to use, especially when you know the piece. But
I love this description. I think you're exactly right. I don't. So why do you? Oh, I've got a couple of things I wanted to say, but I'm fascinated by why you think it's hard. But can we come back to that? I just want to put that so we can come back to it. I totally agree with you. I was having an image for this, a visual image of this filter's relationship to the 3. Right exactly at the moment when you said it is the one that you sort of zoom out. It's the macro view. Because it was occurring to me with your description that depending on the visual image you want to use, that this is either the foundational one that the other 3 rest on, or it's the umbrella one that can be intersected or integrated more completely or more fully with all 3 of the other categories.
I would say it's both.
Yeah, I agree. So, which means that it's kind of like if it's like in, biology, how you have certain minerals or certain aspects on the
certain elements.
DNA chain or elements that are the little helping elements, right? That depending on what they get attached to becomes a new thing, or it activates that other thing in a way that wasn't activated before, for instance. That's what your description seems, and I agree with you. That's what I think exploratory can do for any of these other 3 categories.
Well, it's remarkable if you think about listening. How often are we listening for something specific that we've already picked out? And that, like the thesis statement of the podcast, how you listen determines what you hear, and what you hear determines what you feel and think. If you've already set your mind, set your filter in place, then you keep getting the same old, until you enter a state of exploration where it's like, I never saw that. I've never looked for that because I was too big listening to, the trombones. I never noticed that that's a nice little oboe thing on the side. But without that zooming out and without that specific filter of explore, without that mindset of looking for what you don't know or what you aren't listening for, or don't know you're listening for, you won't find those things.
And I hadn't thought of this before, this description, but we also, one of the things that we haven't acknowledged in all of this discussion is that, and it's present in all of us with every single thing we experience in life. So it's not just music making, it's everything, which is our own prejudices and biases. Right. So we also have biases when it comes to the way we learn and filter and analyze and self-critique, all the aspects about our music making. Biases come from what's contributed to making me up as the individual who I am, right?
Absolutely.
So my environment, the work I've done, the music I've been exposed to, good relationships, bad relationships. Am I naturally a cynic? Am I not a cynic? Am I an optimist? Am I not an optimist, right? So all of those factors that make us up who we are contribute to the biases that we use when we're trying to work on all of these filters that you're talking about with the act and the art of listening. And so I do think exploratory may be the one out of the four that gives us the best opportunity to remind us or to make us aware of some of those biases, to discover where those biases are blocking us from seeing something new or something different about what we're doing.
Right. It is your opportunity to see beyond what you usually see, or in this case, hear.
Yeah.
But I feel like, once again, as we think about listening, who explores listening? How often are we talking to someone who would love if we explored what they're saying, but we've already formulated our answer because of maybe our use of the other filters or our biases? So exploration, I think it's hard to use because it's not considered an option. How comfortable are people saying, I have no idea. I don't have any answers, and that's where I'm going to start. So let me listen to this piece. Let me hear you out. But
I also think that exploratory has a connotation to it that's also, most people assume that they understand what exploratory means. And in the most generic sense, they're not wrong when it comes to listening, and listening to music specifically. They're not wrong. But I think the loss of that is that exploratory has many other levels and layers to peel back and understand, maybe particularly for performers or professional performers, maybe in particular, that's critical to make sure we don't just get stuck in the sort of generic description that exploratory means, I just need to listen to different kinds of music, or I need to do something that I'm just either tend to have a biases against, or a bias against me, or does this make sense? I mean,
yes,
that feels more like a sort of a generic universal application of this. But I think the more useful application of exploratory is to dig deeper into what it can do.
Right. And I think here's a common pitfall that I've seen. People say, I'm exploring, and they actually start using the analytical filter.
Yeah.
They start finding a detail they haven't found before. And that's not a bad thing. And so I found something. But the exploratory filter is a feeling filter. It's an in-the-moment filter. You're taking what the moment gives you. And so you zoom out and you feel out the music, and things start piquing your interest, pulling you in. It's a fun experience. Now, this is another thing that makes it hard. It's hard to stay exploring, especially when something catches your attention.
Yeah.
And it's not a bad idea to follow that thing and see where it goes. But as soon as you engage with any specific element, the exploration phase is either put on pause or ended. You've stepped into experience, analysis, or critique.
I was going to say, I'm not sure that it needs to be sustainable. And I think it's the key, like in the biology of time, it's the key to open up a new perspective that could lead into one of these other categories. But it is the key that keeps refreshing that and rejuvenating that, or leads us into things like you said that we, especially after we've gotten really familiar with a piece of music, right? That we tend not to see new aspects of it to a certain degree, right?
Right.
Depending on what our processes are, I guess.
And it's funny because looking at music history, we revere explorers.
Yeah.
It's like Beethoven.
Yeah.
Who would have thought of doing what he did, or Wagner explored beyond what had been done, or Schoenberg, we never thought about that. And so they're these pillar composers, but we need to have that same approach as performers where it allows everything to stay fresh and it allows it to stay alive, which experience and the exploratory filter, those are the keys to making music really live, make it something you want to listen to and that sparks desire and just that helps you live the life you want to live.
And that application of discovery is for us, the person who's engaging with the music as a performer, is what it sounds like. But
I think there is a direct tie to what we experience and what the audience will experience. So that's the key. If you're only analysis, I don't think you can offer your audience the whole shebang.
Yeah, I agree.
So I guess last two questions: pitfalls of exploration and how to optimize exploration. And to me, the pitfalls are either misunderstanding it, using analysis to explore. It's like, well, that's this exploration, not this exploration. And I think the biggest misuse is not using it when you first hear a new piece of music. If you jump into a piece and start analyzing, I think that's a missed opportunity.
Yeah, I think if we remind ourselves not to use the sort of generic understanding of what explore means,
and not to use our biases as the leader of so what does this piece have? I've never listened to pop before.
Right.
This isn't very sophisticated. It's like that's not what it's about. But if you explore it, suddenly you'll find your toes tapping and you'll find a hook that gets stuck in your head for hours or days. But if you don't explore, then you're filtering out all the good stuff. Maybe that can happen.
Yeah, I agree. I think you're right. I think you can do that. Yes.
So any thoughts on pitfalls or how to best use exploration?
I think the pitfalls are exactly what you described, in the sense that I think it's easy, maybe because it is this sort of umbrella, thing, the macro that we're talking about. I think it'll be the more difficult of the four to make sure that the individual is understanding its application in that sense, instead of getting it confused with analysis or critical, right? So I think it can easily imitate or be mistaken for those two things, and then we end up not utilizing it in its incredible creative, the catalyst that it should be and can be. It will sidetrack it by getting stuck in a little side thing, or it leads into something we think, I'm exploring, and that's actually not what it's supposed to be about.
And I think exploration, just remember, it's an in the moment thing. So that is one of the clues, where if you're out of the moment, if you're stuck looking at this and the music is walking away, it's like you've stepped out of exploration.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the major pitfall is making sure that the individual understands how to use it and how to recognize it for what it is and for what its real purpose can be.
And to me, I think that speaks to just the foundation of applying all these ideas about listening. To start actively listening, I think optimally, besides just saying I'm going to really focus, you need to know what your choices are. And I think that's what the 4 filters offer. They offer you choices to look here, zoom in, or just take the wide view. And once you have that choice, once you know that you have choice, you can start intentionally making the choices instead of feeling around in the dark, trying to find that experience to enliven your practice and get out of the measurable filters. Because the critical and analytical, you can always find them. They're measurable by nature. But when paired with those immeasurable things that have all the fun, that's when they just really come alive. Everything benefits when they're balanced. And I have to say, this is a nerd side note, analysis can be so much fun, but especially when it's the act of listening, make sure that it's not all thinking.
Yeah, and I think, I'll just say this as a last sort of analogous kind of a thing, maybe because I just was engaged with this recently. When I read written discussions of music, articles, papers, dissertations, whatever the format may be, when I get into a section where the writer has begun to tell me with verbiage in my language, is verbally telling me things that are just descriptions of what is happening in the score, technically what's happening in the score. So the sforzando on the third beat is followed by a crescendo that leads to the middle of the next bar, which is then followed by a series of, blah, blah, blah. And so that I immediately start breaking out into hives when I am having to deal with, this type of writing, because it looks as if it's doing something. I'm sure it probably felt like it was doing something to the writer and for the writer, but it's like a car stuck in mud where the wheel is just spinning. It looks like there's something going on, and there's not a single thing happening. There's nothing that's happening, with that particular thing. And so I often think that when I'm just reading a description of a piece of music where I can know exactly all of this by simply looking at the score, it is not amplified for me in any way. Anything that's happening in this piece of music, it's just taking one version of representing and putting it in a different format, right? Period.
Right.
And since I can read music, this is of no benefit to me. And I'm feeling at the moment like that idea is similar to getting stuck into unhelpful ways of using any of these filters, and particularly the exploratory filter, right? That there are things that we can do that seem as if we're doing these things, and they seem right, and it seems to get reinforced, and but all we've done is created a parallel set of activities, or a parallel activity that's not doing anything. So I think that for me, one of the keys of developing these acts of listening and understanding how to use these filters is to also fully understand that we don't want, we should make sure we teach ourselves how to recognize when we are doing something that's just an imitation of the real thing.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that makes sense. It made sense
No.
in my head before I started, sort of trying to describe it. But all of these aspects and listening, you and I have talked about before how we sort of, listening is everywhere around us, and music and especially American culture is always around us too, right? We're always being exposed to it, which can numb us or engage us, or it can have all kinds of reactions or effects coming out of this. And so, and we have to make decisions sometimes to be conscious about our engagement with the music, or whatever that's going to mean in the larger sense. And so when I look at these filters, or when I think about this active art of listening, as you've been discussing and you've been exploring, it just feels to me at the moment that it's not without its own risk of being something that each of us can develop, and we feel like we're doing something that's beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
But that can happen in our process too, right? I mean, that can happen when we think we understand our practicing process, the process of learning a piece of music, whatever that means for the individual. We can have inefficient practice. We think we're doing something. And so I guess what I'm saying is that it seems to me, after this discussion of these filters, that this aspect of it is also something we want to watch out for, and that we want to make sure we actively engage in understanding what the beneficial part of this is, or the actual active part of this is, and the imitative version of this.
Right. I've gotten stuck in that imitative version quite a bit in my musical career, and it's the worst.
Yeah.
It is the worst. And as a remedy to that, I am starting online lessons, listening lessons, to help musicians identify how they're listening and catch some of those things. Because I feel like getting external feedback, because you can listen to the podcast, you can read the transcripts, but having some guidance to be like, I think this is your hang up. You're actually using the analytical, you're not using the exploratory, or you're trying to use the experiential filter, but you're trying to use analysis as the path there. I've been thinking about this a lot, and that's why I'm starting these lessons, to give that feedback so that people can improve their listening.
I love that. I love the idea that what you're exploring here is that these tools that we can have available to us are not just random ghost-like sort of apparatuses that we can luck into, or lightning strikes, or it's all based on inspiration.
That's sometimes how it feels.
Exactly. That's exactly how it feels.
But that's why listening needs to be more explored.
Yeah, I agree.
And for more resources, you can check out the website, approachestolistening.com, or there's a newsletter and a blog there. You can sign up for more information. We're excited to roll those resources out. And the hope is that people can have more of what they want from the music they love, that they know what their options are and know how to use that, so they can practice the skill of listening. Because it's a skill that, well, today it's easier to turn up the volume or find just different music that will be that lightning that strikes. But what do you do when that doesn't work? And I think that that's a state that more people are getting to. And that's what I hope this helps with, helping people know what their choices are so they can choose how they engage with music, choose how they listen, and understand the implications on their hearing, feeling, and thinking.
Yep, a worthy pursuit. Maybe I'll sign up for some of these lessons myself.
It'd be kind of weird, but or we could just have them on the podcast.
I appreciate your candor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Douglas.
My pleasure.
Thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll catch you on the next episode.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. For more information on listening, please visit approachestolistening.com or sign up for my newsletter. The links will be in the show notes.